I would have you this morning, if you would, turn again to the letter of Jude. And we're going to return this morning to the apocalypse of Jude. The past tense apocalypse that we find in the letter of Jude, which is followed immediately by the future tense apocalypse in the book of Revelation. So turn to the 65th book of your Bible, the letter of Jude, and we're going to continue our examination of verses 5 to 16. As I said, this is apocalyptic language. It's an apocalyptic passage, and it is a passage is the main argument supporting the thesis of the letter. It is Jude relating the various judgments that God has brought forth in the past against those who rebel against what he has delivered into the world. In the past, God had delivered a message, and there were those who rebelled against it. There was God who had revealed a place for people, and they had rebelled against it, for spiritual beings who had rebelled against it. And it is Jude in this passage relating the various judgments that God has brought in the past. It is Jude implying then that these judgments will then also be exercised in the future, when the day comes for Christ to come and judge the false teachers of the gospel that are appearing in the church. Now, these verses 5 to 16 begin with the reality that these judgments are from Jesus. Remember, I made the argument several weeks ago that I'm convinced that indeed Jude did write Isus. He didn't write something else. He wrote Isus. He wrote that it is Jesus himself who is the one who is bringing these judgments. He is the one in his pre-incarnate state who brought the judgments of the past, and it will be he in his incarnate state that will bring them into the future. We must remember not to presume upon Jesus as some sort of friend and lover of our souls. He is the Lord of heaven, the pre-incarnate one and the incarnate one, who is the judge of all the earth. Yes, he loves us, but he also comes in judgment. And so verses 5 to 16 begin with a set of judgments, I'll call them initial judgments, brought against Jesus, by Jesus, against direct rebels to his authority. Direct rebellion against his authority. And so far we've looked at two of them. First, those who rebelled against him after he freed them from Egypt. After the people of Egypt were freed, came to Sinai, built a golden calf, he judged them in that place. Secondly, those who rebelled against him in the spiritual realm. Long before the fall, when God had created a spiritual realm of beings, there were some who decided that they didn't want to stay in their place that Christ himself had given to them. They rebelled against him, and what did he do? He judged them. He cast some of them into gloomy darkness. But we come this morning to a third past judgment that Jesus brings, and specifically those who rebelled against him in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. I have you to read verse 7. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulge in sexual immorality and pursuit of natural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. This verse deserves an entire sermon, so you're going to get one. Now, I want to read the verse without the comma delimited piece, okay? Because this verse is a run-on sentence, and so I want to take this sentence apart, and I want to show you first what it's saying at its core, okay? So let me read it without the comma delimited part. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Okay, if I take out the comma separated part, which is just a descriptor, you see the point of the verse. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah, in other words, comparing those two cities to the angels that fell and the people who came out of Egypt who fell, okay, just as these two cities serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So in context, this is an example, another example of the kind of judgment that came upon those who we saw already. The kind of judgment we saw that came upon the Israelites in verse 5, and the kind of judgment that came upon the rebel angels in verse 6. A condemnation placed upon them by Jesus, the pre-incarnate Son. Now, with that in mind, okay, that's simple, right? Now let's look at the comma delimited piece. Just look at the piece in between. Which likewise, okay, so in other words, Sodom and Gomorrah, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. In other words, the little comma piece, the comma delimited piece in the middle tells you why these two cities are being judged. Okay? Without the comma delimited piece, you see these two cities serve as an example. Okay? The natural question you would ask is why? Why are they an example? And the answer is found in the comma delimited portion. Because they likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. Okay, that word sexual immorality means fornication. It literally means improper sexual activity. The unnatural desire, the way that's translated in the ESV, could best be translated very simply, literally, as different flesh. It's two words in the Greek that literally mean different and flesh. Different flesh. You could say it this way: physical intimacy not designed by God at the very core of humanity in what we were created in the image of God. So different, meaning something other than what God had originally intended. That's the idea of different flesh. It's translated in ESV, I think, in a way that doesn't really give you the understanding. Unnatural desire. Yeah, that's okay, but different flesh really goes to the heart of the matter. In very simplest terms, what the writer is talking about here is a perversion of what God had endowed with a specific function. A perversion of what God had endowed with a specific purpose. Okay? It's important that you keep that in mind. Now, I want just, as an aside, I want you to just notice something of the three categories of judgment that Christ brings. I would offer to you that our God is an equal opportunity judge. Okay? He judges his own people, even those who claim to be his, he judges. He judges those in the spiritual realm, in the angelic host, and even a cadre of the reprobate. In other words, if you look at the three, what you have is all creatures in the world. All of the creatures that God created in the world are mentioned in these three categories. Those who belong in the spiritual realm, angels, and then the two that belong in the physical realm, the reprobate and those who belong to God. See it? It covers everybody. The two categories of humans and the one category of non-human spiritual sentient beings. God is an equal opportunity judge. He doesn't carry any favorites. It's important to keep that in mind. Now, let me put before you what I think is Jude's thesis here in including this third judgment in his initial list. And it's this: the judgment that had come upon Sodom and Gomorrah was due to the perversion of what God had formed and purposed as good, right? Sexual immorality, different flesh, etc., those kinds of things are clearly perversions of what God had purposed to be good. And so Sodom and Gomorrah are simply examples of peoples who had perverted what is good in the eyes of God, and God brings his judgment down upon them. But here's how it extends. This same judgment then falls upon those in the church who pervert what Christ has formed and purposed in the gospel. Okay, see where we're going here. There's an example of Sodom and Gomorrah who perverted something, and thus they deserved judgment. Therefore, in the church, and that's the context, right? There's a judgment coming upon those who pervert what is purposed there. Okay? All right, so let's examine this in larger context, and let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, shall we? Now, most of you, I think, are probably familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're not, I would suggest that you go and read on it. You'll find references to it, particularly in Genesis 14, 18, and 19. although there's an early reference in chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 is the first mention of the two cities. In Moses' account of the flood event, or the follow-up to the flood event in Genesis chapter 10, there's a mention of these two cities, in that Moses gives an account of the descendants of Noah's sons after the flood, right? Okay, so you have the flood event, and then the sons of Noah, the three sons of Noah, come out from the ark, and they and their wives go and they begin to populate the earth again, okay? And one of them is Ham, and one of Ham's sons is a man by the name of Canaan. Now that name should sound familiar to you because it becomes the name of the entirety of the land that Abraham comes to when God calls him out of Mesopotamia to come across the Fertile Crescent and into what today we would call Palestine. Canaan was the name of that land, and the peoples living in that land were known as Canaanites. All the various kinds of people living there. That name derives from one of Ham's sons, the grandson of Noah. So the various peoples that occupy Canaan at the time. All of these, this period of time that we're talking about with Sodom and Gomorrah is somewhere around 2000 BC. Just about the same number of years away from Jesus as we are, except in the opposite direction. Abraham entered into Canaan approximately 2000 BC. So the events that we're talking about occur then, in the second millennium BC. Sodom and Gomorrah were located somewhere near what we now know as the Dead Sea. Familiar with the land of Palestine, you know that its eastern edge is the Jordan River running north and south from the Sea of Galilee in the north to the Dead Sea in the south. Sodom and Gomorrah were located in the valley south of the Dead Sea. Probably, I believe, somewhere on the western side of the Dead Sea. I don't have any proof of that. Because the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah have never been found. But somewhere in that area were these two cities. The area was lush and green and prosperous. Lush and green and very prosperous. It was a land that was fed by the Jordan River from the north. If you've ever been to Israel or seen pictures of Israel, you know that the area around the Jordan is lush. But as you go further south towards the Dead Sea, it becomes less and less so, to the point where it becomes virtually uninhabitable. And at this particular time, 2,000 years before Christ, it was rich and lush, and there were many peoples that lived in this area. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, according to Genesis 14, were part of a coalition of city-states. City-states. Now, what's a city-state? You and I think of nations as large geographical areas with specific boundaries abutting other nations, right? The United States has a northern border with another nation and a southern border, well, kind of, with a nation to the south. And so we understand the concept of nations. In that day, there wasn't any such thing. In that day, the world was governed by what are called city-states. What we're talking about is, around 2000 BC, we're talking about something called the Middle Bronze Age. The Middle Bronze Age. And in this particular time, there were no nations, there were simply city-states. Peoples of various ethnicities, common to themselves, would gather together in some place where there was fertile territory, fertile ground, because they were agrarian, and they would build cities. They would build themselves a city in that place. It would be a self-governed city. It was a place unique to them. So the various ites that we talk about in Canaan would each build themselves a little city. So the Perizzites were over here, and the Amorites were over here, and so forth. They build themselves a little city. And typically these cities were fairly small. I mean, you and I think of a city as fairly large. Robertsdale is geographically fairly large, right? But in this time, we're talking about a fairly small area, probably no bigger than a few thousand yards even from side to side. Not very big at all. Typically built up on a hill. And the reason why, of course, is that you could see for a distance, so you could see when your enemies were coming. And they would be surrounded by a wall, sometimes a double wall. The wall itself became an inhabited place within the city. Remember the story of Rahab in Jericho? And the city itself was usually put up on a hill, but one of the most significant factors necessary for where you located your city was a water source. Obviously, you needed to have water, so you would build close to a water source, a well, somewhere down below. The city of Jerusalem, in its initial state, when David conquered it, was one of these small little city-states. It had a little well outside, and the water came in through a tunnel, and that's the tunnel, by the way, that David used to get in underneath the city to get in to conquer the people inside. So you located yourself near a water source, and you always had, of course, to be surrounded by good and lush area where you could grow your crops and graze your animals. Obviously couldn't do that up on the hill inside the city, so you'd have to come out of the city, go down into the valley below, build your crops and your herds and so forth, and then harvest that and take it back into the city and then protect yourself in that place. Sodom and Gomorrah were city-states of this particular time. They were located somewhere in a lush valley near what we now call the Dead Sea, and they were self-governed and so forth. When Abram entered into the land of Canaan, he and his nephew Lot, I often refer to him as Abraham's idiot nephew Lot. I apologize for the adjective, but it fits. When Lot and Abram came to Canaan, Abram, the elder, gave to his nephew the first choice of where they would reside, because Abram knew that they couldn't reside together in the same place. There simply wouldn't be enough space for them to both graze their animals and grow crops, and so Abram said, look out across this lush place, and you decide first. Now, this was a very magnanimous thing on the part of Abraham to do. Abraham was the one called by God. He's the one to come to this place. He was the elder. He was the patriarch. He should certainly have had the first choice, but he decided to give that choice to Lot. And so Lot looks around. He and Abraham apparently have scoped out the territory. So Lot decides, you know, I want to live down there in the southeast corner of this land that's lush. I want to go live near Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Abram says, okay, very good. Now, this was a wise choice agriculturally. This was a lush place. It would have been certainly a good place. I call him an idiot because it was a good choice agriculturally, but it was a rotten choice politically. It was a horrible choice politically, as you discover as the story unfolds. It was also a terrible choice morally for Lot to choose. But nonetheless, he and his family and his crops and his herds all head to the south and to the east down to this territory. Now, when you turn the page into Genesis 14, what you discover is that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with three other cities, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, are part of an alliance. Now, that would be logical if you have yourself a little city and you're self-governed, but you probably can't protect yourself entirely, so you make alliances with other city-states in the area. And so there were three other cities that Sodom and Gomorrah made an alliance with, these other three cities, and they are under the protection of a man who was part of another alliance of 6 other cities, and his name was Chedorlaomer. Chedorlaomer was, you might say, the emperor, quote unquote, of all of these various city-states that had developed an alliance with one another, but they decide at some point during the course of Chedorlaomer's rule over them and paying tribute to him for his protection, they decided to rebel against him. They decided to break away from his authority. Chedorlaomer doesn't take that line down, so he attacks with his forces, and he overthrows the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim and Zoar. He sacks their cities. He takes all of their precious stuff with him back to his own little city, and in the process, he takes Abraham's nephew captive. He takes Lot captive. Now, this forces Abraham to use his forces. Abraham had already developed a little guerrilla force that he used to go and rescue his idiot nephew and return him, but again, proving the adjective to be true, Lot decides to go back to Sodom after he is rescued. He goes back to live in this same place. And in fact, he even becomes a part of the city's political structure. At some point along the way, Lot is elevated to a position of becoming a judge, sitting at the city gate. He has an important role of being one of the managers of the city. If you had a dispute in those days, you would go to the judge sitting at the gate, and you would bring your competition with you, your adversary with you, and the judge would make a decision and decide what was to be done, sort of the court system of the time. And so Lot was in a position of becoming a judge at the city gate. You see this in Genesis 19:1. Now, I tell you all of that. There's much more to the story than that would encourage you to read, but I tell you that because these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, are sitting in a place of great prosperity. Okay, I need you to understand that. It's very, very important to understand that Sodom and Gomorrah are sitting in a place of tremendous prosperity. If we understand what Moses is intimating about the area prior to the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah, we understand that this is a massively lush place where the growing of crops and the managing of herds is easy and prosperous. And so the cities become prosperous. They become wealthy. It's the reason why Chedorlaomer is able to sack these cities and take away all of their stuff. But they're still living in a very prosperous time. And as time goes by, they rebuild their prosperity. And the prosperity of these cities leads them to become decadent and perverse. The prosperity of these cities leads them to become decadent and perverse. I used that word with somebody this week, and they looked at me like, decadent, what does that mean? Okay, decadent. Decadent means a state of moral or cultural decline. A state of moral or cultural decline. Self-indulgence, in other words, if you're a prosperous people, you become self-indulgent, you become selfishly focused upon yourself within that prosperity, and that leads you to a sense of entitlement in throwing off previous cultural norms. Decadence in this moral decline is the idea of people saying, well, I'm rich, I have everything I could ever want, I desire everything, but there are certain things now I desire that are beyond the bounds of what is considered culturally acceptable. And so in decadence, what people will do then in their prosperity is when they run out of fun within the boundaries of what is acceptable culturally, they begin to experiment with things outside of those moral boundaries. That's the idea of decadence and perversion. A prosperous people eventually run out of things to enjoy within the framework of what is acceptable, and then they begin to pursue after things that in previous generations were not considered acceptable. The city of Sodom became so decadent and perverse that its name, its very name, became synonymous with perverse sexual activity. Because there are little ears in the room here, I will be careful to say that, as most of you adults understand, there have been laws on the books in most of the states, the United States, that are named according to this city, and they specifically prohibited certain kinds of human activity, right? Okay? If you don't know what that means, poke your husband, he'll explain to you. Or maybe you should poke your wife, she'll explain to you. I don't know. But in any case, the bottom line is that there are certain laws. Now, you will notice that in America, most of those laws have been swept off the books. The decadence, the prosperity of the nation, the prosperity of the cities had led them to become decadent and perverse. And my friends, this is true of every nation on the earth. Every nation on this planet that has become prosperous has turned decadent and perverse. The Egyptian Empire was a massive empire controlling the world. It became prosperous, it became decadent and perverse. The Roman Empire eventually governed the vast majority of the civilized world. It became prosperous, and over time it became decadent and was overrun and destroyed. And there is no reason to believe that we are any different from any of them. Prosperity leads to decadence amongst human beings that are sinful. It is unavoidable. It has been true in every generation. It is true in ours. In fact, all of it I just said about the definition of decadence, don't you think it applies to our day? So, God purposes to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He comes and he visits Abraham there in that place, you remember? And he announces that Sarah will become pregnant with a promised child. But in the process of doing so, he then turns to visit the city of Sodom to warn Lot to escape before he destroys it. God sends two spiritual beings, two angels, to Sodom in the form of men, we call them an angelophany, to come and visit Lot. Now, there were originally three angels that came to Abraham, but one of those angels was the pre-incarnate Son of God, who left and went back to heaven, and the other two finished the journey on to Lot to warn him to flee from the city. God himself, by the way, comes to tell Abram that there's going to be a son, okay? But these other two angels, they come. Now, the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah was necessary for some reasons. Number one, its destruction was necessary to prevent the spread of its evil into the eventual people of Israel who would arrive there in about 600 years. Roughly 1400 BC, the Israelites would come into Canaan and they would begin the conquest. It wouldn't finish until the days of David, which would be nearly 400 years later. But they would come, and they needed to be protected against a certain form of evil that was perpetuated in Sodom. And so God decided that it was necessary to destroy this people to eradicate the spread of that particular evil. It's also the very reason why the Israelites were instructed to destroy so many of the other Canaanites in the land, because their particular evil was dangerous to the Israelites. Sodom and Gomorrah was also destroyed because it was an act of faith building in Abraham. Come to Abraham, tell him about a child that's eventually going to be the father of a nation that's going to occupy this very territory. And then God turns his attention to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and it acts as an act of faith building in Abraham of what is to come. What's absolutely fascinating about the discussion that takes place between Abraham and God about the destruction of Sodom is that God actually asks the question, should I tell Abraham of what I'm about to do? And God decides, yes, I must tell him. And they have a dialogue, quote unquote. You could call it an argument, but you don't argue with God. We'll call it a dialogue in which Abraham continues to say, well, if you can find 50 righteous people, will you save the city? If you can find 10, if you can find 5, if you can find 1, and God still destroys the city. What's the implication of Lot? So its destruction is an act of faith building. It causes Abraham to trust God and to know that God is the one in control and in charge, the sovereign one who is ruling to move. It would say to Abraham, I am going to make a nation out of your son. I'm going to make a nation out of your son. You're going to know. You're going to know. But then thirdly, and this I think fits with what I just read in Leviticus, its destruction was consistent with God exercising his holiness in the world. Our God is holy, righteous, and perfect. And for God to look upon decadence like he sees in Sodom and Gomorrah and to simply ignore it is to violate his very nature as a holy God. It is to say, It is for God to say, if he were to ignore it, it's for God to say, well, it doesn't really matter if people are unholy. That's utterly wrong. Our God is a holy God. Nothing can stand in his presence that is unholy. And so God purposes to destroy this city because it is consistent with his nature as a holy God. God destroys evil in the world. And I would argue that God goes so far with this destruction and the destruction of the conquest to say there are certain evils in the world that are so great that they can potentially cause the human race itself to go extinct. You understand that there are certain evils that are perpetuated when men step outside the boundaries of what is right that can be extinction level events. I mean, what happens to a society when it decides to do two things? When it decides to kill its children and then not have any. What happens to a society? It goes extinct. And so God, in his holiness, in his purposes, in his decree to accomplish what his eternal will has purposed, sometimes it is necessary for God to destroy. Now we look and say, well, that's not fair. Why would God destroy a whole... I'm telling you that the evils of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and the evils of the people of Canaan that the Israelites came against, those kinds of evils are potentially extinction level behaviors. And God must intervene. He must. And so we discover in Genesis 19 that the Lord rains down fire and brimstone. Now that's the King James words. I think that's the better words. Fire and brimstone, sulfur, hot ash, burning rock, lava. Now I realize that in Genesis 19:23 it says out of heaven. But it's highly likely, probable, that God used the means of a volcanic or seismic eruption to blast these kinds of things into the air that they would then rain down upon the cities and the surrounding areas. The area around the lake, what we today call the Dead Sea, was made virtually uninhabitable. If you've ever done a Google Earth look at the Dead Sea and pan out away from the Dead Sea, you see an area of devastation around it. It becomes somewhat obvious that some sort of cataclysmic event took place there. In fact, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on land in the world. It sits almost 3,000 feet below sea level. Something blew a hole there that eventually filled up with brine from the Jordan River over a period of time. Something blew up there. And so the area around the lake was made virtually uninhabitable. All of the water sources were poisoned, and the sea was killed by a massive infusion of chemical salts. Jude makes reference here in verse 7 to the surrounding cities, right? He says, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities. So he's not limiting his discussion just to those. But we know that there were other cities, I mentioned them a moment ago, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Admah and Zeboim were destroyed, according to Deuteronomy 29:23. But Zoar was spared, and the reason why is because Lot fled there. He fled there, Genesis 19:22. God spared that particular city because Lot decided to take comfort there. What Lot should have done is run back to his uncle up north and allow the entire valley, including that city, to be destroyed as well. But he did not. Now, in Jude 7, Jude refers to it as an eternal fire, a punishment of eternal fire. Now, let me be clear what Jude is saying here. He's not calling this a constantly burning place. That's how it would read, right? No, he's talking about something that is permanently lost. It is eternally gone. As I said a moment ago, Sodom and Gomorrah have never been found. Why? Because they were eradicated from the face of the earth. There's nothing left of them. The volcanic explosion or seismic explosion that occurred in that place took those cities and wiped them off the face of the earth. They're gone. never to be found ever again. That's what Jude, I think, is referring to. They are continually and forever lost, and no one will ever find them, as well as all of their prosperity is gone and all of their evil is gone with them. Now, just as a footnote, I am convinced that this story is historically true. Now, I realize there are some people who are like, are you kidding me? Any story in the book of Genesis is just some sort of myth that people made up in order to make a point. But I would argue that this is probably historically true. Why? First of all, it is not unheard of, is it, for cities to be destroyed by volcanic activity? Do I have to mention Pompeii and Vesuvius? Second, as I said a moment ago, if you take a Google Earth look at the Dead Sea, it is a ghastly area. Something cataclysmic occurred there. There's no way you can get around it. How do you get a space in the middle of nowhere to be 3,000 feet below sea level? Unless something big blew up in that place. But there's another reason why I think this story is true, and this is it. If you're going to say that Jesus is the pre-incarnate Son of God, thus the omniscient one, and he speaks of the cities in historical terms, then by definition, it must have occurred. I mean, you can't turn around and say, well, I believe Jesus is the Son of God and knows all things, and then turn around and say, yeah, I know he talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, but he was really just talking about myths. Really? Why would the omniscient one talk about something which is a fiction and use it in non-fictional sense in his own words? Now, hold that thought. We'll come back to that in a second. But there's another reason why I think this occurred. Sodom and Gomorrah become something unique in history. I'll call it biblical history, but it could also be just human history as well. There's a relevance to Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a relevance to these two cities that I want you to think about. There are more than 24 references to Sodom and or Gomorrah outside of the book of Genesis. More than 24 different references. And in the Bible, and even I think in modern parlance, even in just modern language, Sodom and Gomorrah become exemplars of the judgment of God. Now, what's an exemplar? An exemplar is a typical example, okay? They become a typical example. An exemplar is to say that particular thing there is an example of all of these kinds of things. It's an exemplar. It's the perfect model, if you will, of something. These two cities become an example throughout the Scripture of warnings. Warnings of terrible judgment that is to come. Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, outside of the book of Genesis, are all warnings of judgment that are to follow. In other words, when someone references Sodom and Gomorrah, it is always within the context of saying, be careful, because what happened to them could happen to you, and they become examples to you. Exemplars, we call them. Let me give you some examples. Deuteronomy 29. At the end of the second giving of the law, Moses warns the people that if they fail to keep the law and they chase after the gods of the Canaanites, their fate will be the same as these cities. Okay? So God says, look, I destroyed them for their decadence. I'm going to destroy you for yours if you're not careful. And Moses puts that directly into his writing on the law. Isaiah 13:19. God has purposed for Babylon to become the instrument by which the southern kingdom of Israel will fall. But although Babylon will be used by God to bring it down to its exile, the fate of Babylon will be the same as these cities, because they have chosen to capture the people of Israel out of their own evil desires. So God says, yes, I'm going to use them as a people that are going to bring Israel down to exile, but they're going to be judged in the same way Sodom and Gomorrah were, because they wanted to. And they did it. New Testament, Matthew chapter 11, verses 23 and following. Jesus looks at the city of Capernaum, which is located at the other end of the Jordan Valley, at the top of the Sea of Galilee, exactly all the way to the top. And he looks at this city, and he wags his head, And he says, you know what? If the miracles that I have done in your presence, if the miracles that I have done in your presence, O city of Capernaum, were done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. So the judgment that's going to fall upon you, Capernaum, is going to be far greater than what's going to fall upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. They would have at least repented if they would have seen what I have done. Jesus, you will see in that context, uses it in historical terms. He says, they were judged into destruction, and you will be too. Jesus is not talking about some sort of myth to scare them. He's talking about something that really happened to cause them to repent. Another example is in Luke 17, when Jesus speaks of the return, his return being accompanied by great judgment upon those who are apathetic towards his returning and impending kingdom. And those who are apathetic then will find the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah raining down upon them. Those walking around today who don't really care if there's a kingdom of Christ coming into the world, their apathy will become their judgment, and sulfur and brimstone will fall upon them. And of course, the reference we have in Jude 7 is that the destruction of these cities was due to a specific form of sin, now catch this, that is being replicated by those who, he said earlier, have crept in unnoticed. Okay, and here's where we make the leap back to Jude. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Jude said, were destroyed for a particular sin. They were destroyed for a particular perversion. And that's what's waiting those who've crept into the church unnoticed. Now, let me just ask you a hypothetical question. It's not really hypothetical, but if the history of Sodom and Gomorrah occurred 2,000 years before Christ and 600 years before the giving of the law at Sinai, 600 years before Moses was even born, 600 years before the people ever arrived at Sinai to receive a law telling them certain things were wrong, why are these cities destroyed for a sin not yet codified, not yet given? I mean, why destroy cities for something that they haven't been told was wrong? Because it hasn't been written on stone tablets yet. You ever asked that question? In other words, how could they have known that what they were doing was wrong, given that God had not yet declared it wrong through the specific giving of a law? And the answer to that question is because the sin they were committing was a violation of the very nature of humanity, something inherently understood to be wrong by virtue of being made in the image of God. I need you to understand something known as the natural law. The natural law. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and chapter 5, verse 13, compare those together. And the natural law is this. There are certain immutable truths, unchangeable truths. They have been a part of us from the very beginning of creation that govern us and our behavior. There are certain immutable truths that make us what we are, that make us what we are in God's sight, what He purposed for us to be. They're immutable, they're unchangeable, because they're a part of the very nature of what it means to be human. And the evidence of this law is death. Death itself is the evidence of this immutable truth. Because every man is born, every man violates the natural law, and every man dies. Paul argues that it is death itself which becomes the evidence that there is a certain immutable reality within us, and we don't need to see it written on a piece of paper that it's wrong to kill someone, that it's wrong to cheat on your wife, that it's wrong to engage in different flesh. We inherently know this to be true because it is a part of the very nature of what we are. Here's how Paul writes it. He says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law." In other words, they know. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. The reprobate man may sin and push the boundaries of immorality, but he knows in his heart and in his conscience that what he's doing is wrong. He knows it. Oh, he does everything in the world to suppress it, but he knows it. Paul goes on to say, "For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law, yet death reigned from Adam to Moses." What was the proof that there was a natural law? People died. This law is indelibly written on the heart of every man made in the image of God. And such a law makes it abundantly clear that there are a number of things that are absolutely true and immutable. There are two and only two sexes in the world, and you have been assigned one. And secondly, that sexuality, intimacy, human intimacy, is reserved for marriage between a man and a woman. That is a part of the natural law that exists within the very nature of your DNA. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah, like those people that lived before the flood, were perverting what was inherently true in the very nature of man himself. They didn't have a codified law. They didn't have a book that said this is against the law. They knew that the behaviors that they were exercising were inherently evil because it was contrary to the nature they possessed, both physically and spiritually. They understood. They knew that. In other words, they didn't need stone tablets to know that certain things were wrong. They inherently knew it. So what does this have to do then with the false teachers in the church in 60 AD or 2021? False teachers pervert the primary purpose of the gospel. False teachers pervert the primary purpose of the gospel. Now listen to the next sentence carefully. They prey upon the prosperity of the gospel in the hearts of believers to turn the church away from the original purpose of the gospel to perversions of it. The false teacher comes and he takes the prosperity that we have in the gospel, and we have massive prosperity in the gospel. We have freedom. We have freedom from the, what did I call it in James? The hamster wheel of performance, right? Where we run around trying to make God happy with us, trying to please God, trying to do all the religious stuff, trying and failing. We get set free from all of that. We get set free from death. We get set free from everlasting condemnation in hell. We trust in Christ. We look at Him and we say, He alone is my satisfaction. I got nothing else. And I'm not even going to try to earn something before God. We've been set free. That is a massive prosperity that we have been given. But what the false teacher does is he comes in and he perverts the prosperity. He tries to take that prosperity and turn it into something else. You see, follow this up with a secondary question. What is the primary purpose of the gospel of Jesus Christ? What is the primary intention of what God gave in the gospel? Now look, if you don't think that question is important, you haven't been paying attention. Because that is the question that's being asked in every single church in America right now. What is the purpose of the gospel? What is the message of Jesus? The common answer to that question, given by the vast majority of churches, is that the gospel is about righting injustice, solving economic, racial, and social inequalities among men. The primary purpose of Jesus coming into the world is to make life better for the oppressed. That's the primary understanding of the gospel. Now, I will agree with one aspect of that. I do believe that, yes, the gospel of Jesus Christ does right racial and social inequalities and economic inequalities. It sure does. But it does so only when it changes the heart of men, so that they now think differently about racial injustice and social injustice and so forth. Asking reprobate men to think differently about these categories is foolishness. They cannot. The biblical answer to the question, what is the original and only purpose of the gospel? It is to restore the fundamental brokenness of man before God in his sin. Our problem is not how much money we have in the bank. Our problem is our broken relationship with God. That's our problem. That's the problem of every man. I don't care what color your skin is. I don't care how much money you have in the bank. I don't care what your social status is. It's irrelevant. Your real problem is that you stand before a creator with a rebellious heart. And you need someone to come and save you from God. Because he's the one who rains fire and brimstone from heaven. The false teacher then comes into the church and he perverts this primary purpose in making the gospel more of an engine of societal change rather than an engine of personal change in holiness before God. That is the primary problem that the church is facing today, the definition of the gospel itself. Listen. Be aware of this. Jude contends that the false teacher attempts to throw off the true intentions of God in the world by refocusing the church on something other than the true purpose of the gospel. The people of Sodom took sexuality and perverted it into something it wasn't supposed to be, and the false teachers come into the church and they pervert the gospel into something it's not supposed to be. The primary purpose of the gospel of Jesus Christ is to accomplish what God originally intended for it to do. And it is Jesus himself who will rain down judgment upon them for perverting his purpose. Who do you think is going to be the most offended when the people of this world take the message of Christ and pervert it into something he did not intend it to be? Who's going to be most offended by that? Him! One last closing metaphor. In Genesis chapter 19 and verse 11, as the angels come to Lot and they come to his house, he invites them to his house, and they go into his house, and the people of the city gather at the front door, and they want these men for their perverted desires. And the angels grab Lot, who's standing outside trying to reason with these people. He even offers them his daughter. Again, he's an idiot. The angels grab this Lot by the shirt collar and drag him back into the house and slam the door, but as they do so, they strike the people outside the door with blindness. Most people don't remember that in the story. Most people don't remember that. They are struck down with blindness, and so it says that they literally beat themselves to death trying to find the door in their blindness. Now, that's a metaphor as much as it is a reality. The false teachers, those who come into the church perverting the gospel of Jesus Christ, are blind to the perversions of the gospel. They don't even realize they're doing it. You try to have a rational conversation with them about what the true gospel is about, and they look at you like you just grew a horn out of the middle of your forehead. They are utterly convinced that their perversions are right. It's their blindness that God has put upon them. They're absolutely convinced that their interpretation of the message of Christ is valid, and they cannot see their error. Let me suggest to you what it is that God is doing. God has sent upon them a strong delusion. Here's how Paul writes of it in his second letter to the Thessalonians, when he speaks about the coming of Christ. Now, kind of referencing what's going to happen here. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth, and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refused to love the truth and so be saved. There's a people, even in the church, who are running around and they are deluded. They will not love the truth. They don't even want to hear it. A sermon such as this would cause them to burst into flame. Therefore, Paul's words now, therefore, God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. God has sent a strong delusion upon people. Just as those angels blinded those people outside the door, today what God has done is sent a delusion upon people. You want to know why people think the way they do today, inside and outside of the church? It's because God has sent a delusion upon them to believe what is false, so that when he then takes them and stands them before him and removes the delusion from their eyes, they will know that they were haters of the message of God and deserve to be condemned. Jude says, look, the gospel has a purpose. God intended a purpose in it. And we must contend for it because it is the truth. The world will hate it. The world will despise us for having a Christian worldview. But we must contend for the faith. Otherwise, we stand liable to the very judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day when Christ himself returns.